Okay, good evening, everybody. I was relying on the clock on the wall, but obviously that was foolish of me because it's now actually 6:32 according to our little microphones. Anyway, welcome to tonight's meeting of the Scrutiny Committee of Melton Borough Council. I'll just commence with the normal preliminaries. Members are reminded that we will be using the audio-visual system this evening, and the meeting will also be streamed live on YouTube. Members are asked to physically raise their hands in the usual way they indicate to speak. And can I just say, without being a bit too authoritarian, we have a number of people who are very welcome here tonight as portfolio holders. But can we just ensure we follow that protocol of raising the hand to speak? Sometimes with these meetings, it can turn into a chat across the table, and that isn't necessarily helpful for all the people here. Please switch mobile phones to silent. Should you need to leave the room during the meeting, unless it is an emergency evacuation when emergency exits should be used, please use the marked exit and entrance. I will now provide a reminder of the evacuation procedure. In the event of having to evacuate the council chamber, please leave by the emergency exit. Please assemble at the far side of the front car park nearest to the park entrance. Officers will be on hand to assist persons who require any assistance. Public recording of the meeting. There is legislation that allows the public to film, record or use social media at a council meeting. This must not be disruptive to the good order of the meeting, nor include any filming or recording of the public seating area. And then just on a final point by way of preliminaries, an invitation did go out to all members if they wish to attend tonight. I'm very pleased to welcome various portfolio holders here tonight. And the only other member who's not on the committee is here is Councillor Adcock. He's sitting all by himself over there. But I wonder if you, as you're the only one who's here, you'd like to join us at the table, Jim, in case you want to take part at any stage in the meeting, which you'll be welcome to do so. Okay, I'll now move on to the agenda for tonight. Apologies for absence. I've been notified that Councillor Pritchett is unwell and has given his apologies. I believe everyone else is here. Thank you. Right, can I now move on to the minutes of the scrutiny meetings held on the 28th of November and the 3rd of December of last year. I think you'll recall that we deferred the first set of minutes at our last meeting, or second set at our last meeting, because it had been held so recently. So can I ask whether I can have a proposer to accept those minutes? Councillor Child, the seconder. I'll come to matters arising, and Councillor Thwaites. Okay, can I just have a show of hands that the minutes are accepted, or is there a correction? Okay, Councillor Gordon, you wish to raise a correction?
Yeah, for the declarations of interest, where it says Councillor Gordon declared a personal interest in minute number 22, as she's a tenant of a Melton Borough Council property. Could you add that I could stay in and participate as no decisions were being made? Okay. Please, thank you.
I'm sure we can make that addition. So subject to that change, can I just have a show of hands to agree the minutes, please? Thank you. I'll move on to declarations of interest. I'll invite any members who wish to do so to make declarations of interest in respect of items on the agenda for this meeting. Councillor Gordon.
Yes, I am a member of Waterfield Leisure Centre, but only insofar as using the facilities and equipment, so I can stay in and participate. Also, for agenda item 8, I have an interest concerning council rents, as I'm a council flat tenant, so I will leave at that point. And where it's got about the decent homes, council housing stock concerning new bathrooms, kitchens, heating equipment. This is general, and I've been advised that I can stay in and participate. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gordon. Of course, we have to make sure we tell you when the part that you want to leave for is over. I think sometimes we get so wrapped up in the meeting, we forget people are outside. Any other declarations of interest? No, thank you. Move on to item 4, which is the review of the forward plan, which has been circulated with the papers tonight. Does any member wish to raise any issue relating to the forward plan? Councillor Thwaites.
Yeah, I'm going to apologise in the fact that I've not. This is the first time I've noticed that the forward plan has changed, and some items have changed on that forward plan. Now I'm going to take the 5th and say it's because I was on holiday for a long period of time, but there are items on the forward plan that were there in November. My favourite being the Gretton Court, which is no longer on there, but it may also have been amalgamated in other items on there. So apologies if I missed where the changes to the forward plan have been made, but I've missed the explanation of some of those items on there.
Okay, thank you for that. You've only referred specifically to Gretton Court. Are there any others you want to, so we could actually roll it up into a
well, I mean, I only really noticed it this afternoon, but there are several. If I go back through the history of the forward plan from, say, October, November, December, January, there are changes that have happened within that time period, and there's several changes. So I can't say all of them, but there are several changes on there.
Ed, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, just to say, just perhaps as a practical step, really, it's obviously a live working document, so it is evolving all the time. If it's helpful, Councillor Thwaite, if you want to refer any particular questions you've got through to the democracy team, then we'll give you an answer on each of those as to what the rationale is for any change, and if it's due to come back in due course, we can update you on that as well. So happy to deal with that outside the meeting if it's helpful.
Are you happy with that?
Yeah.
I mean, I think making the general point, the forward plan is on the agenda for every scrutiny committee. So we have the opportunity to raise issues such as those that you've just raised. But I think the onus is on us to actually raise those. And I think the point made by the Chief Executive is quite right. It's a live document, so there will be changes as we go along. And that's part of the reason it comes onto our agenda, so we can identify and, if necessary, question about any of those changes that have happened. But thank you for raising that. Are there any other issues that members wish to raise? Councillor Cliff.
Thank you. It's just a question, really. There's nothing behind my question. It's just for information. Pretty much every box on the date of decision says not before 9th of January 2025. We're obviously beyond the 9th of January now. I just wondered, are we going to get any more detail on the dates of decisions? How long is it just going to stay at not before 9th of January for? Is there any more thought going into that on any of the items listed?
I perhaps look to my colleagues if they want to add anything specifically on any item. I think generally the not before is because of the statutory limitations around taking decisions before a certain date. So that's why that not before is put in. So there's absolute clarity that we don't breach any requirements about transparency and forward publicity. In terms of when things will actually happen, again, that can be fluid. Perhaps if there's a particular question or a particular issue, we can answer that again outside the meeting if it's helpful. If there's a formatting question or actually a way in which we could represent the information in a way that's more helpful, then again, happy to have that feedback and we can look at it to make it as informative as possible, because that's obviously what its purpose is.
Yeah, I think it just from someone who, and there might be a really technical reason why it's like this, and it's kind of a statutory kind of guide as to why it's like this, but just can continually have not before 9th of January 2025 just doesn't feel very satisfactory in terms of the information that's coming through. I mean, is it going to be like that for another 12 months or another 6 months? Or yeah, it just feels a bit bizarre. It's always felt a little bit odd to me, but there may be a perfectly good technical reason that I'm just ignorant of, so forgive me.
Any other questions anyone wishes to raise or observations? Okay. Move on to the review of the scrutiny work programme. Before opening it up to members, I just want to mention 2 things. One is, you may recall at the last meeting, we explained that the proposed item on cyber security, which is in the work programme to come to committee, would in fact be dealt with by way of a workshop, for fairly obvious reasons, because if we want to talk about issues around cyber security, do it in a public meeting is not entirely appropriate, and the committee accepted and agreed to that. Just to say, we are still looking at a date for that workshop, but it will possibly be in February if we can line everything up so that works. And oh, sorry, not February. That's the second one. Sometime between now and April, provided everything lines up. And the second one is that we're still working on setting up the workshop on waste strategy and contract delivery. Again, the committee may recall that relatively recently, it probably seems like a lot longer to him now, we appointed a new manager in that area, and quite reasonably, I was asked if we could allow some time for him to work up the necessary preparation for that meeting, because he's obviously dealing with a lot of things in his first period. The date for that is possibly going to be in February, but again, it just needs nailing down. So, Michelle, did you want?
Thank you. And I think just to add to that, one of the particular challenges with that item that was due to come forward a few weeks ago is the change in, well, the clarity now around legislation and national policy direction. And that's obviously caused some questions for us around what that means for our waste services contracts and how we build all of those new requirements in. So the thing that will hold the date of the workshop up is the modelling that's required to help us to actually then have tangible options to discuss with members. But we will come back to you as soon as possible. I know the modelling work has been commissioned.
Thank you for that, Michelle. Right, I've said my piece. Anybody want to comment further on the work programme or raise any issues regarding what's currently in it or what's not in it? No? All right, we now move on to the next part of the agenda, the main event, so to speak. The Chief Executive and members of SLT will provide a presentation on the 3 budget papers that are on the agenda. The reports are draft cabinet reports and will be updated and finalised following feedback from the committee this evening. So this is our opportunity to have some input into shaping the final form of report that goes to Cabinet. Members should, however, note the reports are due to be presented to Cabinet on the 6th of February. The reports will then be presented to Council for approval on the 12th of February. Officers will go through the whole presentation first, with the opportunity for questions following the presentation. Questions will then be taken for each report in turn, and we'll deal with each one sequentially. So if members can bear in mind, if you've got a whole list of questions you've already got, let's break them into the 3 sections, please. So we have some harmony in the way we look at this. The only thing I would throw in before I throw it over to the presentations, and certainly speaking to Dawn, she indicated that if it's just issues of clarification, i.e. something isn't clear as we're going through, happy to take that as we go along. But if there's substantial questions about particular points, can we save those till the end of the presentation, and then we'll have a general discussion for the whole committee. Thank you. So over to, is it you first, Ed?
It is. Thank you, Chair. Good evening, committee members. And thank you for the opportunity to talk you through where we've got to in our budget preparations so far. I'm going to just do a couple of slides just to do a bit of a scene set and provide some context. And I'm going to hand over to Dawn to do much of the heavy lifting in terms of the detail. And then, as the Chair mentioned, we have other representatives from SLT here tonight to be able to support answering any questions that you may have. So, in terms of the things that we have in our mind as we, and these are the things that we are in many cases legally required to contemplate as a council as we prepare our budgets. Firstly, obviously, as a service provider, we have to make sure that we have resources to deliver those services to the legal, at the very least, statutory minimum requirements. And we also have to think about how we respond to demand pressures that may be being placed upon us. Particularly, I would highlight, and I'm sure Dawn will speak to it in a lot more detail tonight, around the pressures around homelessness and temporary accommodation. And that is certainly not unique to Melton. That is a national problem and a national challenge that we and others are grappling with, and obviously the ongoing residual challenge that exists around cost of living and the extra demands and vulnerability that's created across our communities. So making sure our finances are able and our budgets are able to respond to those challenges is key. We have, and I'm sure you will be well aware, have legal obligations to set a balanced budget. And we've seen a number of councils fall foul of being able to do that and issuing what they call Section 114 notices. So we have to make sure that we comply with the legal statutes that we have to meet our financial sustainability rules, to demonstrate efficiency and also value for money, something which our external auditors pay particular attention to. Then, of course, we have the aspirations that you have articulated as a council, which are described through our corporate strategy, both the 2036 vision and the 4-year corporate delivery plan, which was approved by council in February this year. And that sets out the plans and aspirations that you have on behalf of the community. We then also need to think about how we address any organisational risks or challenges that we might be facing at any given time. We have to respond to government policy, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, because there's lots of government policy changes, as I'm sure you'll be very familiar with. And just to be clear as well, the proposals tonight are initial. They have been developed through discussions with our cabinet, as we've contemplated all those things that I've described already, and we've considered a load of various options, and the ones that have come forward are their initial proposals, and they are obviously here tonight to listen and hear your observations, your reflections, your feedback on those proposals, and they will have an opportunity to consider those before making any final recommendations on the 6th of February. And as the chair said, ultimately those recommendations would then go to council on the 12th of February. So that's the kind of the orchestration of the process that we are embarking upon today. In terms of local context, so things that just to be mindful of as we go through this process and through the presentation tonight. So we are a prudent, well financially run council, but it is also true that we are susceptible to financial shocks because we don't have a significant amount of reserves, and we have had to use reserves the last couple of years to balance our budget, and obviously that is not in the long term a sustainable position, so we have to be careful and manage our resources effectively, and we can't overcommit on things. We also have challenges around resilience, so our size and scale makes us able to act with agility and flexibility and design things hopefully in sometimes a better way than much larger organisations can. However, it also leaves us susceptible to resilience issues and capacity challenges, and sometimes even single points of failure, just where we have particular roles and responsibilities held by individuals can be quite a challenge. Managing expectations of our communities can be a real challenge, and you know, it's a striking fact that our budget in real terms is reduced by around 50% since 2010. So it's little wonder that we can do all the things we used to do, and we have to think really carefully and work really hard to try and meet the expectations and aspirations of our communities. Sector skills shortages, some real challenges around things like planning, legal, and other professional skills within the sector. Again, certainly not unique to Melton. We do pretty well to bring together a really strong team and to keep them for a long time as far as we can. But it's also very difficult because there are simply not enough of some key skills and individual capabilities to go around the whole system. So that is a real challenge. And then also we do have volatile income streams around things like planning and parking, which then can make forecasting for financial matters difficult. Then just turning to the national picture, I've already touched on this to an extent, but clearly inflation thankfully has eased a bit now, but over the last year, 18 months has been a real issue for us and a real factor in terms of affordability and sustainability. And ultimately, the rises in council tax that we see are insufficient to cover the increasing costs that we are facing. So that puts us in a difficult position from the outset. The finance settlement and the change in government policy around the finance settlement is not necessarily, and this is not a kind of a party political statement, but it is not favouring district councils, and it's not favouring necessarily rural councils either. The shift in the funding formula is diverting more resources towards those areas of greater deprivation, and that is then therefore taking away from shire districts like ourselves, and so that creates some risk in terms of our future viability again. UK SPF, the good news is we did have it confirmed for another year, which is helpful. The bad news is we saw it reduced by 40%. So whilst it's still helps us out, not as much as it previously did. And then that government policy reform I already referred to. So the 3 or 4 kind of big ticket items really, waste, which is going to come back to this committee because it's a massive piece of work. And there was recently a paper at Cabinet that set out a plan to address those legal obligations that have been placed upon us. And as I've mentioned, this committee will have a role in trying to work out how we respond effectively to it. Planning, again, some major shifts in national planning policy. We anticipate and await the planning and infrastructure bill as well, which is shifting the way in which planning will work across the country. And we've seen some government announcements further on that again today. Housing regulation, we've talked about a lot, and this council has been well placed to respond to. And as we saw over the course of the last year, has been only one of a few councils so far to have delivered a compliant outcome to the inspection. So we are well placed for that additional challenge, but it's still an area that there is significant government focus and attention to. And then finally, of course, the devolution white paper, representing probably the biggest change in local government in a generation. And as a council, we will have to respond to that and contemplate what it means in terms of future local authority provision in this area and more generally. So some implications around that we'll obviously get to. But for tonight, it's very much about how we make sure we set our budget for the coming year and ultimately make sure we have sustainable medium term as well. I'm not going to say too much more. There are just a couple of slides which remind us about the corporate strategy and Vision 36. So the 8 vision statements from Vision 36 are just on the slides, but I won't speak to them because hopefully you're fairly familiar about the aspirations that we set out and agreed to in February last year. And then the more granular 4-year corporate delivery plan with the 6 priorities that drives a lot of our current focus in terms of objectives and work programs and action plans with our teams. So I will leave it there, Chair, and I'll hand over to Dawn now to cover off the rest of the presentation. Then very happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ed. So just as a bit of background, I'm going to start off with the provisional finance settlement, still provisional, that came out just before Christmas. I did send round a briefing note to all members on this, but I think it's really useful background to where we are financially. Business rates is a core element of that provisional settlement. Nothing really particular in there, just enabled us to undertake the calculations to calculate our retained business rates. Just on that, however, following that announcement, we fill in a government return, which gives us all the various elements. And what I will say is when you see, regardless of what the debate is tonight and any changes to the budget as a result, when you see the papers that go to Cabinet, a number of elements have changed. It doesn't affect the bottom line. It's just where we place some of those figures as a result of filling that business rates government return in. Revenue support grant, whilst that looks a bit of a non-event in that they rolled some grants in and we suffered a net loss of £8,000. The significance around that is that when we move forward and they look to potentially reduce our funding further, the fact that they've rolled in a number of specific grants just gives them more ability to further reduce our core funding. So I think that's interesting that they rolled some of those in. It's under the badge of a simpler system, and I think, yes, it is more simple to not have lots of different pots of money, but as I say, it gives them that capacity to say there's something there we can cut further. No surprises around the council tax referendum limit, the higher of £5 or 3% for district councils. There's been a lot of lobbying for a number of years now to try to make that £5. It's been at that level for a long time. And if that was to be made £10, which is what the lobbying's around, that would make quite a difference to a council such as Melton. Highlighted in the finance policy statement that came out at the end of November was the discontinuing of the Rural Services Delivery Grant. No consultation around that, a lot of noise from the sector and a lot of lobbying, particularly from the Rural Services Network around that, because that is a significant blow to a lot of rural shire districts. And you can see there that for us, that was sizable, just under £250,000 there that we lost from that. New homes bonus as well, keep saying that that's going to end. It's the final year. So again, another 1 year of new homes bonus, which is a reward for the number of homes that you build. We had quite a good year in 24-25. It's taken at a fixed point in time. So because we've had less houses built than the previous year, we've seen a reduction of just over 150,000 in next year's budget from that. Now, normally that loss on the new homes bonus, you would see that compensated through what was called the funding guarantee. So what that funding guarantee used to do was it would say that no council would suffer a loss in their overall funding from central government, would suffer, yet we would all get a gain of around 3% was what they would say. There was still that kind of guarantee, but instead it's been rebadged as a funding floor rather than a funding guarantee. The core difference being that when they look at our core spending power and say that no council will have an increase of below 3%, they take into account your ability to raise council tax. So previously that was ignored and it was literally just an increase in government funding. This time it was government funding plus council tax. So that loss from the new homes bonus was almost compensated by council tax, which means that that loss in rural services delivery grant and new homes bonus was a real loss and was not compensated. The removal of that rural services delivery grant was used to fund a new grant called the recovery grant, of which we did not receive anything, and that was not a surprise because that formula was based on deprivation and favoured the inner city unitaries and metropolitan councils. The other core element was the employers' national insurance compensation, where they said that we would be fully compensated for the increase in employers' national insurance, direct costs of employers' national insurance. We're still awaiting the actual figure on that. They issued a formula and the general consensus seems to be that we'll be funded at only about 50%. So with £174,000 direct cost to us, we'll probably see something around the order of 80 to 90,000 coming through that final settlement. So as I said, it's still provisional. Consultation closed last Wednesday. And we're waiting for the final settlement there, which usually, if I'm lucky, comes in around about cabinet date. But if not, it's got to come in before council because we need that to formally set the council tax. They also issued a consultation on where funding might go from 26-27. So they said that there would be a full review of the funding formula. Now, we know they've been talking about this for a number of years, but they've committed to doing that from 26-27 onwards. The consultation is very high level, doesn't really give anything away, and is mainly based on principles rather than anything that you can deduce. But it is certainly certain that rural district councils will not be at the top of the list for funding. And then I've just put in a couple of graphs there really to show you what that increase is. So in what the impact, of that provisional settlement was. So what that graph shows is what the change in core spending power was by authority type from that provisional settlement. And you can see on there that on average, Met's gained 8.37%, and they're right at the lower end. Districts only gained 0.32%. And that was that impact of the repurposing of the rural services delivery grant and moving it into that other recovery grant. And then this is even more stark. So what this actually shows is what the change in the government funded element of that core spending power is. So again, you can see there that you've got the Mets at the one end at 10% in terms of the amount of core spending power that's funded from central government, and districts at -5%. And that is exactly what I said about the fact that they still gave you a funding guarantee, but they took into account council tax. So even though it was showing on the previous slide that districts saw a 0.32% increase in their core spending power, the majority of that was funded from their own council tax revenue. So if you didn't choose to increase council tax by the maximum, you would see even a bigger loss in your core spending power. And I think that really sets the scene really for why balancing the books is even more challenging than it was ever going to be for next year, and why that review of the funding formula from 26-27 is quite worrying. And in terms of that review, what is that likely to mean? As I say, it's quite high level, but they have said that they're committed to what's called a business rates reset. So a lot of councils benefit from the growth above a baseline in business rates income. And if they reset that back down and they don't do any kind of damping or transitional relief, Melton could potentially lose £1 million per annum from that. So it will not be as stark as that. There will be some form. They have said there will be some form of transitional relief. The question is, how many years are they going to compensate you for? And how many years are the ones that gain from that reset going to want to continue to fund those that the government feels is overfunded from any transitional relief? The other key thing around that is that there's a lack of clarity as well over what they might do about renewable energy. So at the moment, any kind of solar farms or wind farms, etc., there's a planning authority that we approve and have brought onto the rating list. We benefit from 100% of that business rate, so we retain 100% of that. So the question of that, will it also form part of that reset? But also, more importantly for us, we've got around £250,000 planned in terms of planning applications that are on the books, so to speak. And over that period, 26-27 to 28-29, that could have potentially brought in another £250,000 of retained business rates for us that through that reset we could potentially lose. That could also mean this whole reset across Leicestershire area could mean that our current business rates pool becomes unviable. We're not the only district that the whole of Leicestershire is above that baseline, and if it's all reset, that means that pool would no longer be viable, and we're getting around £500,000 per annum from that as well. So again, another worrying factor. Will there be other grant reductions from those grants that have been rolled in? We just don't know. And another core element of new funding that has come in and mitigated some of our potential gap for 25-26 is what's called the Extended Producer Responsibility Allowance. So this is the revenue that's generated from the tax on producers from their waste that's being distributed to local authorities. And we've been guaranteed a minimum of 544,000 in 25-26. And they've said that's for 1 year only, that they'll guarantee that. The money will still be distributed after from 26-27, but it will be incorporated into the funding formula. So again, it's another way of, one, we don't know how that's going to be distributed. Will it be distributed in the same way that the other funding is, i.e. METs and deprived areas to benefit from that? And thirdly, will they use that as well in some way to maybe fund transitional relief or to use to reduce further? So quite a worrying time, I think, in terms of the way forward. So against that background, if I move on to what the numbers are looking like for next year. So I'm going to start with the general fund and general expenses. So based on a 2.7% council tax increase, and that's the balance after you take into account special expenses to keep within that 3% referendum limit. You have just under a £300,000 deficit. So that's a budget based on existing services with changes for demand, contractual obligations and provision for inflation on things like pay and contractual obligations. So that's a £300,000 deficit. We have growth proposals coming forward of 289,000, some ongoing and some non-recurring. The proposal is to use where we can and where it meets the criteria, and the criteria has only just been released for UK SPF, so that's still going through a process at this stage. but initial ideas are to fund 186,000 of that growth from UK SPF funding, which would mean that the balance for that growth would need to come from your unearmarked reserve, the corporate priorities reserve of 103. So that's in line with your policy for that reserve, to use that for capital and revenue items of a non-recurring nature. And that brings you back to your structural deficit, so of the just under 300,000. And that would need to be met from, again, your corporate priorities reserve, bringing your overall contribution to balance your reserve for next year to just over 400,000. So that 400,000 is made up of the non-recurring growth and that structural deficit. So I won't go through these line by line. There's a lot more information in the report at Appendix A and B for special, A for general, around what growth bids are proposed, and you can see in there the split between what's proposed to be non-recurring and one-off, and what's proposed as recurring expenditure, so ongoing beyond 1 year. So that concludes what I was going to say around general fund, general expenses. Can't see anyone wanting any technical sort of questions, so I'm going to move on to special. So on the proposed budget for special expenses, Melton Mowbray, so based on a 2.99% council tax increase, that has a deficit of just over £6,000. We've got a one growth proposal of £50,000, and that is proposed to be funded, part funded from UK SPF and the balance funded from the play areas reserve. The detail around that growth is in your packet, Appendix B, but one of the core elements of the work that post that's proposed will be around getting a play area strategy and understanding what the future repairs and maintenance needs and replacement needs are of your play areas. So whilst we don't know what we need in that play area reserve, we need to invest in that post to actually identify that, and that's why that's considered appropriate to use that reserve to fund that growth item. So through funding that growth in that way, that leaves you back to your deficit of just over 6,000, which would again need to come from your special expenses reserve fund. And then I've referred to that, so I'll move on. So in terms of the proposed council tax levels there, you can see there at the bottom that all of the council tax together comes out with that average of 2.99, just within your referendum limit. And then you can see there how that's spread. So as I said, the special expenses are set at a level to the parish special expenses, which are your closed churchyards. They're set at a level to balance the budget, with 2.99% on special expenses, resulting in a balance on general expenses of 2.7. Just to say on Frisbee, the reason for that significant increase, and it's the same for all of those parish special expenses, there's such a low number of residents and bandy council taxpayer that any specific one-off pieces of work cause quite a large variation. I'm sure a number of members know there's some urgent repairs that are needed to the closed churchyard wall in Frisbee. That's quite significant. And what we've done is we've spread the cost of those over 3 years. So we'll do all of the works in 25-26, but that will leave a deficit on that account, which will roll forward for 3 years. So that council tax there is based on funding a third of that next year, and then it'll be a third the year after and a third thereafter. There has been engagement with the parish council around that as well. And then just moving on into future years projections on general expenses then. So so that 300,000 deficit will roll forward, and obviously we've then projected forward demand increases, inflation increases, and known service changes, but not any future growth in those years, just keeping services currently at the level they already are. And you can see in there quite a worrying trend there that in 26-27 that 300,000 turns into potentially 1.2 million, then 1.4 and 1.6 million. What I should have said that because we don't know, sorry, earlier on, because we don't know what that national insurance amount is yet, anything we get from that will reduce all of these figures, and including that 300,000 deficit. So that's without any national insurance funding from central government. And the reason that those figures start to increase in that way is the amount that you can raise, even from maximising council tax, just doesn't cover an inflationary increase alone in terms of pay and contractual increases. So, you know, you've already got that shortfall moving forward year on year. And it's really difficult, from what I've said earlier, to try and predict 26-27. So we've not built into these expected projections a business rates reset, because you can imagine what the number would be, but we have built in that extended producer responsibility allowance is only for 1 year, hence why there's a sudden jump there as well. So any recurring growth, they're cumulative, so any recurring growth that you approve in 25-26, when that UK SPF drops away, will impact as well in those later years. And then on special expenses, a healthier position, although it is a small fund, and variations, quite modest variations in predictions, can have quite a significant impact on that fund. So a bit of a health warning there. But the difference here is, as you move forward, those inflationary increases in costs, if you keep council tax at 2.99% for those years, more or less balance each other out, and that's the difference. So you slowly start to move into what is at the current time a modest deficit into a modest surplus over that 4-year period. We always do some sensitivity analysis, and talking to some treasurer colleagues the other day, one of them said, you know, how to get across to members, I don't think there's ever been any greater uncertainty than we're facing now. And you can see that in terms of those numbers, really. So, you know, even the best, they're all deficits. So if we say, well, you know, if we were perhaps a bit more less pessimistic about that, what could that mean? What would it mean if we had that business reset, rates reset in full? And you can see there, they're all deficits predicted, and even the best case is still quite a sizable deficit on there, and the worst case is absolutely, you know, significant. You will notice in the report massive long list of risks. I know that's been picked up before in future years. It is just so difficult for some of those numbers to try and forecast and predict, and they are exactly that. They're forecasts, they're budgets, they're not actuals. Just to pick out, I suppose, the significant ones, the finance settlement could change, and certainly we'll get something from that national insurance, even if it's not 100% funding. Business rates is always quite volatile in terms of predicting growth, appeals, and vacant periods, really. So that can have quite a difference in terms of your business rates. The major one on there is around that food waste collection service. So we have not made any allowance in the budget for the costs of introducing a food waste collection scheme. And that is because we are being told that we will be fully funded for that. Now, we know on the capital side, we're not fully funded. So, you know, a bit sceptical, will we be fully funded on the revenue side? But in the absence of knowing anything on that, we have assumed that the neutrality. So that is a big risk, one of the big risks in terms of the budget. I don't think there's anything else particularly on there. I'll let you, if you've got any questions, you can ask me at the end on that one. So in light of those dire predictions. We do have a financial sustainability plan. We're always looking at what we can do more efficiently, where we can reduce costs, where we can be smarter about procurement. What sort of areas do we need to replace people? All those things, looking at how we can be more efficient and get better value for money. And this is just a flavour of some of the things, and some of those are small, from small to the large. So we're having a customer service journey review. We're estimating a saving around 50k from that. Despite all those changes around waste, we're looking at the costs of that service. Where can we do things differently? Where can we save? Challenging the contractor, working with them to try and bring down those costs. We have had a little bit of success on that, and I think there's probably more to come as well. The asset development programme, long-term programme, and that's one of our core longer-term potentials around looking at all of our assets across the piece and seeing what we can generate maybe a capital receipt from and what we can generate more revenue from, or just reduce our costs as well. The LUF funding is obviously with the stockyard development. There will be some form of rental income there. The question is how much and how soon we start to see that coming into the council. And replacement car parking machines, and a new contract for that will certainly looking like that's going to bring some decent revenue savings as well. And on the Welland procurement, we're, instead of just looking at expanding the Welland procurement and taking on more clients, we're looking at that a bit differently now and seeing, can we get into developing our own procurement framework so we can sell to other councils and generate a commission on that, similar to, I suppose, to what ESPO do, for those of you who understand ESPO. But that's a long-term piece of work and will take some investment. So I'm just going to move on to capital now as well. So a really modest programme, and I think that reflects where we are financially. So the new items, other than your long-term LUF programme that's being proposed, is our replacement of our environmental maintenance vehicles. That's as expected and funded from our renewal and repairs fund. Externally funded disabled facility grants. The second year of our street lighting LED replacement programme. That's in the programme, but there is a review around that programme and seeing, so there might be some changes around that coming back to members in the fullness of time, but it is the second year of that scheme. And then an element of UK SPF is capital, so we've just recognised that in there, but again, we need to design the schemes and decide where that's going to be allocated. So taking into account the forecasts for this year, the forecast outturn for this year, revenue budget proposals in the reports and the capital proposals, where would that leave our reserves and balances at the end of 25-26? Well, our general capital receipts would be almost depleted, so not a lot of capacity there to fund any further asset capital repairs. But we do have just over 600,000 that was ring-fenced some years ago now from the sale of the land on Nottingham Road that was ring-fenced for leisure vision. That's entirely at your discretion if you wanted to reallocate and use that, and indeed on some years you have used it for other non-leisure items, but it is capital and it has to be used for capital. It cannot be used for revenue. The corporate priorities reserve is estimated at just over 2 million, taking into account further contributions from the business rates pool. And I think the key thing about that corporate priorities reserve is, whilst that looks quite healthy, in the report you will see that when you take into account those forecast deficits, if they are correct, and that's the kind of deficits we're looking at, that unearmarked reserve, which is really only your main unearmarked revenue reserve, would be depleted by the end of 27-28. So I think that puts into context that whilst that reserve is probably at one of the higher levels it's been for a while because of that business rates pool contribution, in the context of your deficit and potential deficit, it would soon get swallowed up. And you've got your risk-based general fund working balance of £1 million and your special expenses of 50,000 there. We've got a little bit more left in our regeneration innovation reserve, and that's kind of seed money. The policy around that is seed money for things that will generate a return or to invest in something that will have a service improvement. And then your special expenses general reserve is quite low at 62. So if there's any kind of significant shortfalls, which we often see around things like cemetery income, etc., that could soon be depleted. And what I would like to see really is that special expenses working balance, looking to increase that when affordability allows, because it's been at that level for a long time. And when you look at some of the variations that we've had, that's probably not at a high enough level now. And I'm just going to move on to the housing revenue account, another paper on your agenda this evening. So obviously the budget and the asset management plan all follow the 30-year HRA business plan. And we know in the early years of that plan that we're in a kind of a spend position. So we're spending to improve our assets to get up to decent homes. And you will see there that for 25-26, that we actually move from a position of taking from the reserve to actually planning to put something back into the reserves for that year. And also when we've projected forward from when we originally did that HRA 30-year plan, we knew that in those first early years, we were actually going to have to make some hard decisions to try and keep in balance. But actually that's moved to a more healthier position, still challenging around things like energy improvements and maybe tenants' aspirations, but it is in, a little improved position there. The rent proposals are in line with a government policy, which is CPI plus 1%, and that brings you an increase of 2.7% on rents. And you can see there the numbers there for what that means in terms of average social rent. And also just in terms of affordability, we've got a sizable number of tenants on housing benefits or universal credit to assist with affordability. You've got details of the HRA capital programme, and that follows and is in line with the recently updated asset management plan. And that just shows you where that funding's coming from to fund that HRA capital programme. So there's your position on the HRA reserves. And as I said, we are in the period in the HRA business plan where we're doing a lot of investment in our stock. So we expect that's not unexpected to see those reserves starting to reduce. And then in the later years of the plan, as the stock's up to a better condition, we'll be in a position where we steadily start to increase those reserves. And then there'll come another peak where we have to start spending again when some of those improvements come to the end of their life. So just to sum up then, with, keep talking about COVID, but we are still in a position where some income levels have never recovered, like car parking. The world's changed and we just don't generate the same sort of revenue that we did. Been some improvement, but not at the same sort of level. And inflationary pressures do continue to impact as well. We've still got some time limited grant income that's seen us through some lean times, and we're trying to balance that as best we can. But as that ends, that is adding to our pressure. I think I've said enough about the provisional settlement and what the draft budget's based on. The growth proposals that you've got in front of them, they're all drawn from discussions with Cabinet members or where the SLT considered that there's an organisational need or challenge. Important to note that 25-26 is a third year, as Ed mentioned earlier. This will be the third year in a row that you've had to use your reserves to balance to fund a structural deficit. So that is quite concerning, and we are highlighted in various national data sets as being at high risk due to our level of our reserves comparable to similar authorities, and also the rate at which we're using those reserves as well. So that's a key risk for you. And then just in terms of the next steps, I think as Chair already highlighted a lot of this. So we're seeking views and input from the committee this evening, and then the Cabinet will meet to consider the budget. Council obviously will be ultimately setting the budget, and then we'll have the actual formal council tax meeting at the end of February, which will include the preceptors. And just to note there that, you know, SLT will continue to focus on that financial sustainability plan and the development of various change initiatives in order to try and address our sustainability issues. And that's the last one. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dawn. Always a fun and uplifting event. Actually, listening to part of what you were saying, I was reminded, I was listening to an interesting piece about the annual update of the Oxford Dictionary, where they put all the new words and new usages in, and I was tempted to submit next year that fully funded means not nearly enough tough luck. So thanks for putting everything into context and going through in such detail. Are any other members of SLT, forgive me, Councillor Gord, I'll come to you in a moment, going to add before we go to questions? Okay, so we now go to the opportunity to ask questions or to raise issues relating. Yeah, I'm seeing the hands. You know, I'll get there in a sec. What I'd like to say is that people may have already come with a whole load of questions prepared. They may be asking questions arising out of the presentation. What I propose to do initially is, however many questions you've got, at first asking, you get up to 3. And if you've got more, we'll come back to you in due course. But that's just to allow it to go around the room, or rather than just dwelling on one person at a time. So first hand that went up was Councillor Gordon. Councillor Gordon.
Thank you. Yes, it's to do with the special expenses, to do with the cemetery, the extra land that we're going to have to need eventually. Do we already have land earmarked where you'd have an idea of the costs, or have you still got to negotiate with private landowners where the costs could be more precarious? And I just wondered if we have enough money when the time comes, you know, from what you're doing now, you know, will there be enough money in the pot at that time, just in case you have to do the latter, you know, have negotiations? Thank you.
All right, Michelle.
Thanks, Councillor Gordon. So this is one of our future big challenges. So some work was done a couple of budgets ago, actually, to secure some funding to be able to do some expansion works in the current cemetery. Those works actually will take place over the next few months now that we've got our staff and resources in place. In terms of the future, some initial feasibility work was done to assess the type of land, size of land that would be required. Some options were drawn up, and they haven't been developed into any kind of business case at this stage. But the cost is significant. So we were looking at around £1 million plus. So as you'll have seen from the presentation, that isn't funding that this council has access to just at the moment. So there would be a piece of work for us to do, working with Dawn to look at what the options might be around financing something like that. What we are doing in the meantime is we're monitoring demand for the cemetery, and you'll see one of the challenges in the budget paper is that cemetery income has been lower than we would have predicted. Fewer people are choosing to be buried in the cemetery, and that has had an impact. But what that does mean is that we've got a little bit more time in terms of working out what that longer term strategy might be. So it's very much on our radar in terms of a risk, but at the moment there isn't a definitive plan or a funded one. Thank you.
Councillor Child is next one.
Yeah, when I wrote this last night, I must have been feeling sorry for you, Dawn, which is very rare. I am concerned about the pressure being put on the corporate priorities reserve, which is in the end going to lead to it being put in an unsustainable position in the future. It's propping up the 24-25 overspend, the use of the reserves in order to balance the 25-26 budget. There's the borrowing for a potential deficit on the food waste programme, and with it also being unlikely that the government's going to provide full reimbursement to the national insurance contributions, there That's probably even a bigger nail in the coffin. So page 120 illustrates this position, forecasting in 27-28 it will be exhausted. Should future year-end deficits in the MTFS be realised, then service reductions will have to be considered, and we will need to draw on reserves to achieve these. The council is very vulnerable to the low level of capital receipts, which has been highlighted tonight, of 60,000. So that's where I am. I think we've got to be very careful by 27-28 whether we can survive by then.
So I tell you, that's more of a
Yep. I'm open to a response if anybody wishes to. It was more of a statement. No, that's okay. The second question is, can you talk me through why the service recharges, etc., to tenants and the impact of actual charges being different for Phoenix House and Parkside? That's at page 119. How's this cropped up to be a high risk budget?
Okay, through you, Chair. So we have an outstanding level of service charges that we need to invoice for. So we've been having to accrue for these in the accounts based on estimates of what that's likely to be. If they're different to what we've been accruing, then there'll be an amount that we have to write off.
Have invoices gone out to these people who are occupying the Phoenix House and Parkside then, Dawn?
I believe we're still under negotiation with some of them.
Going back, how long?
I'm sorry, I haven't got that information to hand for all of them. I think some of it might be in the revenue report, but I haven't got that. We'll have to get back to you outside of the meeting.
If you could, perhaps you could circulate it to the whole committee. Yeah. And third question, homelessness budget for next year is how much?
Yeah, for next year it's 306,000.
306.
By homelessness, you mean temporary accommodation?
Yes.
The temporary accommodation is 306. The homelessness budget is larger than that because obviously it includes preventative measures as well and staffing costs.
Okay, so that would be equivalent to the 199 overspend in the current year.
The current year is the current year is forecast to be around 348,000, so it's lower than the current year. I know that the director might want to come in, but that's because we've got some measures in place to try and mitigate that cost.
Yeah, because it can get out of control. This can, because I mean, £100 a night you're probably looking at in Melton. So over to you, Michelle.
Okay, Chair, thank you. So yeah, we've obviously highlighted this as a risk, not a risk just to this council, but a risk across the country. In fact, it's putting homelessness pressures are putting some councils into very, very difficult territory in terms of the sustainability of their budgets even into next year. For us, we have, I know we've got a scrutiny session planned later in the year, haven't we, to talk through this in more detail, having discussed it in the social housing allocation item. We've identified it as a risk, and what we've agreed is we will develop a risk strategy approach so that we look at how we can increase the provision of accommodation to use as temporary accommodation, because where we're accommodating people, we have a legal duty to do so. So we must fulfill that legal duty, but doing it in a way that is as cost effective as possible. We're really clear that the use of nightly paid accommodation, like bed and breakfast accommodation, is expensive, and that is really challenging for us. And we've had a multitude of issues, one of them being delays in people moving on from temporary accommodation purely because of the availability of suitable alternative housing. Sometimes there have been some policies that may be restrictive, for example, around pets, and that has caused some challenge. We have had a reduced availability of supported accommodation, certainly since decommissioning of services across the county. And we've also had people that are occupying supported accommodation staying there for much longer periods of time. And all of those things, alongside the complexity and the increased demand, make for a really difficult situation to manage. Homelessness is a demand-led service. We do our very best to manage those costs, but what we've started to do now is I'm meeting with the team to go through each of those cases that are in temporary accommodation to understand how long their length of stay has been, what are the things that are preventing them from moving on. And when we bring the scrutiny report back to you around homelessness and temporary accommodation, we will do that in a really joined up way to look at how can we do things within our housing policy arena, for example, around pets and ways in which we can support people to move on that might alleviate some of those pressures. The other thing that we'll be doing is looking at how we might use some of our assets, or how we might be able to acquire properties and things in the future that we could use as temporary accommodation, so that we're not having to use bed and breakfast accommodation. So all of those things are happening. We see it as a big risk, and what we've done in terms of the projections for next year is look at what's a realistic amount of spend, and how confident are we that we can bring down compared to what we spent in this year, which is why that budget is lower than the actual spend this year. So lots of work on it. You're smiling at me. I can see you've got a follow-up question. So we'll do our very best. What we've done in terms of the projections for next year is we've looked at the demand month on month that we've got. We have looked at average length of stay, and then we've looked at how quickly we believe we can move people on, and we've adjusted the budgets on that basis. Lots of proactive work happening, lots of strategic work happening, as well as the day-to-day. So it's demand-led. I can't be sure of the levels of demand that come in, but Dawn and I feel confident that it's a sensible projection for the future. But the committee needs to be aware that homelessness demand remains a risk.
Thank you, Councillor Child and Michelle. If you've got more questions later, you can come back. But anyway, over to anybody else who wishes to raise any questions or comments. Councillor Atherton.
Thank you, Chair. This is actually from Don. Even though he's not here in person, he makes sure he's heard. So his is on page 115, 116. He's asking, is there enough justification by identifying a need for an outcome and community coordinator and a strategy sport to keep fit staff? Is his question. Can we actually afford it? Is what he wants to know.
Thank you, Chair. So I've had some correspondence with Councillor Pritchett outside of the meeting, but very happy to provide the information to the committee as well. The first thing that I'd say is for the two posts that have been identified by Councillor Pritchett, so this is the community coordinator and then a role within the Healthy and Active Communities team, which shows against the strategic sports budget. Both are growth items and both are proposed to be funded from UK SPF. External grant funding, both are considered to be eligible within that. So on that basis, affordable within that pot. In terms of the justification, there's been a huge amount of work that's been done to look at growth proposals, to assess them, to balance them against priorities and commitments of the council and the needs of the borough, and then to look at them in the context of financial constraints. But I'm happy to run through each of them. So in terms of the community coordinator, this has been part of the UK SPF investment plan from the very outset. And what this seeks to do is to fund it for a further year. And over the previous 12 months, we've combined a number of those UK SPF commitments and interventions, and they're all delivered by this one post holder. So, for example, parish liaison, community engagement, and also the rural food hub. And there have been some real successes, particularly around the rural food hub, which has got some attention from the LGA as a piece of really good practice. I'm more than happy to provide in writing to the committee, because I'm sure you don't want me to read all of the points out, but I have provided Councillor Pritchett with an overview of all of the outputs and activities of that post holder over the last 12 months. It would be our intention in the future to look at either legacy and exit planning in a really managed way, so it doesn't create the shock for the communities that have then engaged really positively, or to seek external funding to support that on an ongoing basis. But one of the key things that we've been doing is linking with existing parishes and community groups, and we've built some really good relationships there, so we can help communities to be more resilient, particularly to things like cost of living pressures and some of the challenges that we're seeing in our rural communities. So Another bit of information to share with the committee is that we've had confirmation that through the UK SPF programme, this particular programme of work has been successful. It's enabled us to meet the outcomes and the outputs that we set out to achieve. And it's done particular things around supporting community organisations, creating volunteer opportunities and a lot of volunteer hours, and increasing that engagement with communities. So on that basis, it's felt that it's continued to deliver the outputs and outcomes associated. If I can move on to the sports one. So this is a really small team that achieve a huge amount. And we have what I describe as a patchwork of funding here. There has been a challenge over recent years of a decrease in external funding through public health because other organisations have had to manage budget pressures as well. And it's a team that are achieving a lot with a very small amount of money. We have undertaken a particular impact assessment before bringing this proposal forward as a growth bid, and our professional assessment is that the outcomes being achieved mean that the investment being requested and through the growth would be good value for money. In terms of a number of things that are being done, having this in place allows us to secure other external money and projects. It allows us to maximise the added value from our leisure contracts. So a lot of the delivery through the leisure contract is supported by the team. And it's allowing us to do things around steady steps to help an ageing population at risk of falling, cancer rehabilitation, and keeping people moving. So it's directly contributing to the health outcomes for the community. It is a discretionary service. There is a choice to be made by the council, which is why we've gone through a process of assessing impact and outcomes. Again, I've given Councillor Pritchett a list of outputs over the last 12 months, and I'm very happy to share them with the wider committee. But the reassurance I would give is that we've been through a process of assessing this alongside lots of other proposals and have determined that this is one that would add ongoing impact and value for money.
Number 2.
The list is long, but I really are very picky with it at the moment. It's also on page 115, 160, and it's growth items. He's asking, is it worth taking on a funding coordinator when only 2 years left at NBC? His words, not mine.
Not sure who wishes to ask that. I mean, I'll make the observation that nothing is written yet and it's business as usual, but maybe the Chief Executive would like to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just reinforce that point. I mean, this council still has a commitment and obligations and aspirations on behalf of its community, and those need to be maintained until told otherwise. And I think it's important that we do maintain that focus. The post is one that has to deliver within actually 2 years, and that's one of the things that we've stipulated. Obviously, it's a new aspiration or a new area of funding that we've not allocated this kind of resource to before. And there are funding streams out there, and we have a new director who's experienced in securing those funding streams. And I think we would be foolish not to try and exploit that expertise. Yeah, so I think it's one that certainly should remain for consideration for this council, with my suggestion, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. If I may, because I got a question about that as well. So if I just throw it in. Just for clarification, so it says in the proposal that it's expected this post will be self-funding effectively within 2 years. Is it going to be issued as a 2-year contract initially, or is it going to be a regular full-time post, which will then face the possibility of questions being asked in 2 years if they're not fully funding themselves?
I think, if I'm honest, there's a bit of detail that we still need to work through, and it's something that I'm keen the director takes consideration on in her new capacity, but I can see she's indicating to come in, so perhaps I'll hand over to her.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? That's the first time I've used it. So what I have looked at is whether or not it's a full-time post or whether we utilise that funding to support bids. So from previous experience, you maximise the opportunities that you've got through existing funds. So you've achieved UK SPF funding, you've got levelling up funding. How can we use that to leverage in further funding into the town and into the borough, but then also utilising that funding maybe as strategic funding coordination, maybe not necessarily a post. So that's some part of the review that I'm undertaking at the moment.
I'm sorry to. So how it's written here may not be how it ends up in the final delivery. Yeah.
In accordance with how we can fund it through UK Shared Prosperity, which we're still receiving guidance from at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Number 3.
According to this, we had a funding coordinator in previous years at Melton Borough Council. The role was then discontinued. Have we learned why it was discontinued and why it improved? I don't know. It was before my time.
Yeah, through you, Chair, it was quite some time ago. I suspect it was probably due to funding reductions and efficiencies. The role definitely focused more on external funding to the council rather than supporting community groups and other bodies, whereas this focuses not just on council funding, but also making it sustainable in terms of funding for other bodies that are currently looking to the council to receive support. So it's a different focus.
We'll come back to in due course. Right. Any other members wish to either raise questions or observations?
Thank you, Chair. I just have one very quickly. Obviously, it's worrying to hear the state of the finances and the use of the reserves over the last few years. There's obviously quite a risk there. There was mention of potential sales or development opportunities from assets. Is there a strategy in place? And with those sales that are, I think, ongoing, sale of the cattle market, and potentially others, is there a plan potentially to enhance those assets before they go for sale, such as de-risking, getting planning, etc., to see if we can maximise? I'm not a fan of asset sales. I think it's very short-termism, but if it has to happen, then is there a plan to maximise those opportunities?
The simple answer is yes. There is an asset development programme which was approved by council a number of years ago, and there's a number of strands to that programme. There is a working group that work on the policy development aspects and particular sites and consider those. Again, it's an area that is being looked at by the director, and I think there is not a one-size-fits-all approach to any of the assets. It's about how we maximise the value. So sometimes that might be disposable, and we have made decisions in the last year around particular sites for disposal on the open market, which is about just maximising commercial return. There are others where we may benefit from redevelopments to retain it as an asset, but one that can work harder for us. So, and obviously you'll be aware of, well, of course, about the ongoing dialogue with our partners around the future of this building and how we can maximise its value, as well as unlock local service provision and infrastructure. So it's a very much a multifaceted programme, but one that the director is taking on board as well and picking up as part of her new portfolio.
Councillor Thwaites.
Sorry, just to follow on from a piece on there, because one was just an observation on the asset development in the fact that one garages weren't included in that, and that's for me you trying to get the realization of an asset we're not using and we're not getting, rather than some community buildings that we are getting use from, and putting it up like there, putting those up there always generates questions. When is it going to close? Is it going to close? What's happening with it when we're not necessarily looking at that? But I would prefer to see that things like assets that we're not using, i.e. the garage sites, that's my opinion, that should be a higher priority than some of the community centres which are still being used. That was really an observation. The next, unless anybody wants to sort of mention anything more on that.
Respond to that.
Yeah.
Then you can come back.
Yeah, I'll just come in on the garages in particular. Those The garages are covered under the Housing Asset Management Plan, and they the most recent one that was approved in December does include a programme of investment in garages, and also mentions the proposal to bring forward recommendations for disposal of garage sites that aren't used, and there is no demand for those garages. We've recently taken a decision to award a contract to a contractor to refurbish some of the garages, and that work will be completed by the end of March this financial year. This financial year, and then in next financial year we have another capital budget to refurbish another site. So there'll be a combination of garage block refurbishments on the garages where we have a high level of demand, and recommendations for disposals of sites that we don't have a demand for.
Further question?
Thank you. Yeah. I'm trying to put into use some of the training we did the other night, in the fact that it was saying that, because I'm not an accountant, never going to be, never want to be, but trying to work on this. And so taking particular points that I know and looking at, and does it make sense when you sort of dig, when you stick the stiletto into the, and then does it make sense? So I'm looking at within the HRA things like the independent living charge, which everybody knows is close to my heart, but it's in there as a 5% increase, and in the document it actually says that it's justified further down in I haven't put the page number down, but in section 5.25, which doesn't actually justify the 5%. So again, I didn't dig any deeper than that, but it's just trying to understand there's an increase of 5% there, and it's not actually justified or defined why it's 5%. So I was just trying to understand that.
Sorry, can I just clarify, Councillor? I can't find the bit that you're referring to.
Right, it's in the HRA.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I didn't, but it's section 2.2.
Oh, 2.2.
There's a mention of the independent living charge and a 5% increase, and it says as per 5.25. Okay. Then if you go down to 5.25, sorry, 5.25, Oh. I made that mistake, thinking it wasn't there at all, but it is further down. That it doesn't actually justify why it's 5%, or it didn't in my mind. Again, I'm saying I'm not an accountant.
Okay, I mean, it does refer to the council's policy, so I don't know whether that goes back to the paper that went to members when the charge was introduced, because there was a proposal covering a number of years, I think. So we can look into that and get back to you outside of the meeting.
Third and final. It was just again a comment and looking for maybe some sort of thing. But in further in that document, it talks about the errors in billing, errors in collection, errors in accruals as being some of the reasons for extra charges within this year. And I suppose it's looking for what confidence have we got that that's it, I suppose, is, are there any other errors that we think, or have we put in the actions, have we put in the checks and balances to make sure that those mistakes aren't made again in the future?
Yeah, so that one, there was quite a lot of discussion at Cabinet, and the portfolio holder was very interested in this aspect and has been assured that the steps have been taken to mitigate that one.
Okay, thank you. We'll carry on as we are. I've just recognised, and I take responsibility as chair for this, having set out at the beginning that we'll deal with each section separately. We've drifted across the whole piece, but I don't think that's really an issue. So we'll carry on in that vein. Any further issues members wish to raise? unusual. Well, if it gives people thinking time, I've just got a couple. Well, I've got more than a couple, but I'll just deal with a couple first off. First one, on page 50, well, it appears in a couple of places, but it's certainly there on page 54. Part of the funding for the stockyard is the match funding from us, you know, from the sale of assets. So we raised it through sale of part of that site. Bearing in mind that it's becoming increasingly rare for construction projects of any sort to stay to budget, is there any liability for us as a council beyond that 1 million should costs rise as part of the stockyard project?
Well, the funding is finance, I think, is the simple answer. But we're managing that very tightly with Rutland as the accountable body. And what we're doing is if costs escalate or procurement comes in and it's not affordable, then we're re-engineering to bring that down within budget. And I think members might remember as well, we had a really good audit report on this one with no recommendations. So, you know, I think that project is being very tightly managed.
So I was really just inviting the assurance that however it proceeds, that is the commitment and it doesn't go beyond that. Thank you. Second, on page 55, a minute, and I'm sorry, I can't scroll back to find it to quote it directly. Yes, I can. So it refers to an approach to, because of the unaffordable level of investment required on the general fund assets, it's proposed to focus on essential repairs, which will be reviewed annually. I mean, it just sounded a little note of concern in my mind because, you know, patch and mend, I've gone through phases in my life, properties have been falling down. All I could afford to do was patch and mend, but it ended up costing me more in the long run because I hadn't addressed issues first off. And what kind of assurance can we have that if issues are identified in our assets that clearly require some fundamental work being done, we won't just sort of, patch and mend short term only to have higher costs in the long term?
If I come in first, I think the reality is that at this stage, we do not have sufficient money to do all the things we'd like to do proactively. So therefore, we are having to prioritise quite rightly those things that we have a statutory obligation to do and that have an ultimate health and safety implication, which is why we are prioritising those essential things, because that is naturally where you must go first. Where there are particular obligations or elements around repairs and maintenance on particular assets, we do have some funding set aside for those, but it is limited. We have renewal and repair funds for particular areas of our operations. So we have some contingencies aside, but not as much as we would like. And I think that is an ongoing challenge for us. And I think particularly as we look at the asset development programme, we need to make sure we set aside funding for our day-to-day work, not just think about what else we might do as a fresh project, because we are limited. I don't know, Dawn, has anything to add to that at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of affordability and there's been lots of hard discussions over the years. And if I refer to things like the Waterfield Leisure Centre, when we invested in that last time and again now, it would have been great to set up some form of sinking fund to address the deterioration. But unfortunately, local authorities do not have cash back depreciation. So we do the best we can where we can, but it's one of our risks.
Thank you. It clarifies it. And then thirdly, I'll pass over the puzzlement that with a higher than average over 65 population, we can't come up with a viable proposition for a crematorium, but that was just something I noticed that's a slight contradiction. Final point, I mean, and this is a slightly political one, on page 75, when it and in the statement about the MMDR South, and it talks about us continuing to work with our colleagues at the county council, but recent statements from the county council were very emphatically that they don't see any prospect of that project going ahead in the short, medium, or even long term. So I just wonder whether that is just an expression of optimism or a realistic assessment of what the situation currently is.
I think there is still a challenge around the financing of that, no question. The county council are still committed to our local plan, and the delivery of a relief road to the south and the development of the southern neighbourhood is fundamental to our plan. So there is still active work going on around that between ourselves, the county council, and the developers. And there may have to be some phasing to it, and there may have to be some pragmatism to it. But there is still a commitment and effort going towards delivery of it, and it's vital that it does, because our local plan does depend on it at this stage.
Thank you. I'll pause there. Again, I invite any members who haven't yet contributed who wish to add anything to the discussion. Okay. Is that back to Councillor Child?
Yeah, one for Michelle and Chris. It's void repairs where the accrual is the reason for the 424,000 overspend. Surely Northgate system would flag this up, that the properties haven't been built, so we ought to be reserving, accruing. Why didn't we pick it up?
So you're right, the Northgate system does identify financial commitments against each void. The issue that we have is that when a property first becomes void, we don't know the full cost of the work that's going to be carried out. So what was happening previously was that the team were creating the log, creating the commitment on Northgate with a nominal value against it. But then that wasn't updated at a later date. So where we've referred to the fact that we've made changes and improved the processes that we follow, that now involves an update of that figure when we have more clarity over what the actual cost is. So what had happened was we had accrued an amount, but not sufficient to cover the cost of those. And then we had the combination of the issue with the contractor being delayed with invoicing, which meant that we had a considerable amount that hadn't been paid for at year end.
If I may just add to that, is that this is identified by the team. So we've got a colleague who has worked really hard just to make sure that the processes are improved. And Councillor Child, I think you might have left the room because this one did come up, but just to give you the assurance that we've worked hard to provide that confidence and assurance to Cabinet as well, because clearly this was flagged and we've been needed to obviously be accountable for that and make sure that we've minimised the risk of that happening in the future. Thank you.
User knowledge or the way you picked it out of the system, so the users do understand the system. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Is there an assurance it won't happen again? This is on page 157. Your rent statements were sent out with incorrect totals. I think this was flagged up by a tenant.
So
can you talk me talk me through it?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the wording in the report is. The rent statements weren't sent out with the incorrect totals on them. There were errors. Well, there weren't errors. There was lack of clarity over the way some of the charges were shown in the statement. The bottom line figures on the rent statements were accurate and correct, and that's what we found when we looked into the issue that was raised by two of our tenants. But we found that the totals shown were correct. And we have the bit around the clarity on the rent statement in terms of the charges has been rectified, and a note is going out with tenants to explain that.
Found the book you're referring to, Councillor Charles. So you're talking about two different issues. So the one that Chris has outlined was a tenant did raise with us, exactly as Chris has outlined, and that's a conversation we've had directly with the housing regulator as well, just to make sure there was nothing we'd done there in breach of any kind of standard, and they're satisfied that there isn't. So what's highlighted in the report is this relates to the changes to the wellbeing charge at Gretton Court, and there was an issue, as it says in the report, with the housing benefitable elements of the charge not being applied correctly. So that was corrected and adjusted. But yeah, they're two separate issues that you're referring to.
Time. Okay, thank you.
Sure, there's no more Don questions. Again, taking the point of looking at different things that I was aware of, and then trying to find them within here. One is the one-off planning expenditure that at one time was down as a critical risk. This relates to the appeal and the appeal costs. And I was trying to see whether they actually relate to 24, 25, 25, 26, but I couldn't actually see them there in any of the areas.
Yeah, it is referenced in the general fund revenue report. So whilst we don't know what the final figure is, what I've done is, in terms of, it's in the reserve statement where I show what the predicted reserves is, and at the bottom of there I've put an estimate in for things that are outstanding, might happen, might not, might be a different amount, and then I've expanded on that, and that's one of them.
One fine one then.
On page 122, that's on. It's on page 122.
The other one is just for once I'm being picky on spelling here, but if you want to have a look at page 129, item 6, I'm not quite sure that's how you spell by-election. But I want to be politically and correct in all terms.
Any further questions or comments? Either means you were extremely thorough and everyone's satisfied with what they've heard, or we're all just so depressed by the general financial picture in local government, we find it hard to get our heads together. I've got one, if nobody else is raising it, I've just got one final point of clarification, and it's on page 101. And this is probably for Chris to respond to. Very excited to see I can't remember the number now because I'm not at the page, 1.52 million being sent to energy efficiency in 2025, 26, and then zero afterwards. Now, that means either there's some funding we're accessing that enables that in this year, but not beyond, or at the end of this year, every property we own will be completely dealt with. Or there might be some further costs we need to be looking at down the road that we can't quantify them at the moment. So could you just clarify where we are with that?
Yeah, so the 1.5 million that's allocated in next year is if we're successful with a bid for SHDF funding, so social housing decarbonisation funding, we've put a bid in for funding for that, and we hope to find out either at the end of this month or early next month whether we've been successful with that. That funding will address around about 80 of our worst performing properties in terms of insulation. So the majority of our solid wall properties that have no insulation in the walls at all. Where future funding is available, we will be looking at putting a bid together, and the amount that we'll then look to fund from capital will depend on what that funding allows us to apply for and what properties that we have that are suitable. So there isn't an allocation in there yet, but there would be every intention of doing that as funding becomes available.
Thank you. I knew part of that before asking the question. So the supplementary is given the direction of travel with the housing revenue account. And again, I think many of us who've been following that are very encouraged to see where we're going. Is there potential further into the future, whether funding is available from outside or not, to do further work on energy efficiency and other improvements?
Yeah, so as of this year, in terms of our projections, there is capacity for more investment, full stop. But one of our priorities in the business plan is energy efficiency measures, because that was highlighted by tenants as a priority for them. So regardless of funding, we could make decisions around funding that work in the future.
Councillor Gordon.
Please stop me if I shouldn't say anything, because I am a council flat tenant. So if I'm doing something wrong, then please stop me. You was on about insulation for houses. I really believe that all the flats in general do need insulating, and they always get overlooked. And this is something I think that we should be looking into as well.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the funding that we have applied for at the moment, we basically look at all of our properties. We have energy efficiency data for all of them. So when we have funding that becomes available, we would always prioritise the worst performing properties. So what we have is a lot of very old solid wall properties that have no insulation in them at all, whereas other properties like the flats that you mentioned do tend to have a cavity wall. They do tend to have some insulation in comparison to those worst performing. So as we get funding, we'd always move forward and look at the properties that we have that are the worst performing and prioritise those. So when we get to the point where the flats are our worst performing properties, that's where we would focus our investment.
Chris, any further observations? Chief Executive.
As we conclude, I just want to offer a couple of final reflections from me, if I may. So I think, as you've heard from Dawn this evening, this is a really challenging financial situation. I don't think in my career I can remember a time when there's been more uncertainty around the way in which we are funded, with new funding streams coming in, others going out that we've relied upon. It's a really turbulent situation. Throw that then into the devolution white paper and the uncertainty that created. It is a challenging environment. The bit that I would want to leave you with and give you some confidence over is that we are under control. You know, we are not out of control in any way, shape or form. And Dawn and the team have a fantastic grip on our finances, as do the portfolio holders. So I think, you know, I can give you that assurance that it is turbulence, but we are under control and we can manage it. Doesn't mean there won't be difficult times ahead, and there might be some difficult decisions to take. But I just want to give you that assurance, and I'm conscious there's lots of difficult messages. I wanted to leave you with some pause and hope for optimism going forward as you conclude this meeting, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And, you know, I'd echo that. And I think there's lots of good reasons to get a little bit down about the general state of the public sector and public finances. But certainly my observation would be that as an authority, we have got a grip on things, and a realistic grip on things. And clearly, you know, should things change in terms of our overall financial position, that will be addressed appropriately. But I think the right plan is in front of us at the moment. We might nitpick on certain details, but the right plan is there. Okay, on that basis, I'm going to bring the meeting, or this part of the meeting, to an end. We're only being asked to note these reports. Obviously, the various comments and questions raised will have been captured and will be presented to Cabinet in the normal way. So I'm closing those items. I've not been advised of any urgent business. So I declare tonight's meeting closed. Thank you all for attending.